So I want to start to think a little bit about presentation of this animation. Now, I could do this really with any animation that I create, but for the sake of the demo, I'm going to focus just on this simple walk cycle. What I want to do is, right now, I got a pretty decent animation. I think the composition is, more or less what I wanted. I could reframe the camera, but more or less, I think it does a pretty good job of showing off the animation. Now, it might be that I want to look at a side view as well, and I could probably get some kind of render of this to profile the side view, or maybe more accurately, I just want some kind of orbital view. I want this whole animation to rotate. So maybe I'll have a couple of different versions of the animation. One version where the animation is just standing still and walking, and I've already captured that render. But now maybe I want a camera that orbits around my my character, and so I got a couple of different ways to achieve that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a camera, and I can create a camera the same place where I started to create lights. Now, we've talked about cameras in the 3D design class and a little bit in this class already. We've touched on it, but I want to take a deeper dive into cameras. When I click and choose camera, I get a standard camera object that shows up in the object manager. In addition to that, the camera that I've created actually adopts the view that I'm looking in. So in other words, when I create a camera, now I get this framed camera that's showing me the composition of my render. And if I scroll my mouse wheel back, you can see that I actually have a camera object. Okay. Now, just for the sake of the demo, if I click and introduce another camera, again, I've just created a camera looking at the same exact view that I've composed just now. So if I roll back again, I have another camera in the sequence. So let me just delete the camera that the second camera that I created, and so it's a good idea when you're creating standard cameras to get a sense of what your composition is just in the viewport, compose the rough shot, and then introduce your camera at that point. Okay, so it will adopt the viewport. Now, I have this camera, and I've established this camera from the exact same viewport. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look through this camera to actually get the camera as the viewport. Right now, the perspective viewport is the standard view of this viewport. If I go to the camera pull-down menu and choose scene cameras, I can choose any camera that's inside this scene. So in other words, if I had a second camera, I'll just introduce that second camera. When I choose the scene cameras, I have a choice between camera 1 and camera. Now, I actually don't want camera 1 in the equation, so I'll delete that. I could choose to look through the camera, and now I'm actually inside the camera adopting that camera as the viewport. And if I move, if I scroll, if I pan, if I rotate, I'm actually moving the position of the camera that I'm looking through. So be careful. If I want to preserve this composition and I start to move the camera, I'm actually going to change the position of the camera. If I want to go back to my editor camera, or the view that we've been accustomed to looking at this whole time, I'm going to go to the camera pull-down menu and choose editor camera. The editor camera, this is what we've been using in Cinema 4D. We're actually inside the editor and looking through the perspective viewport. Okay, so this is the editor camera that we're using. I can choose and look through an existing camera and then back to the editor camera. Make sure that when you look through a camera that you don't stay in this view and start modeling. You only want to jump into the camera view when you're getting ready to render, or when you're thinking about your shots or composing your shots. You want to get in the habit of jumping out of the camera when you're not actively using it. Now, I also want to draw your attention that when we're actually looking through the camera, there's a couple of indicators on screen. We're actually looking at the scene camera. That scene camera that's listed is checked. It has a check mark next to it. In addition to that, there's a little icon that lights up. There's a little camera view icon that is white here, and my mouse is rolling over it. And you'll see that when I look back through the editor camera, that icon turns black. We can also jump in and out of the camera by clicking on that icon in the object manager. So that's a pretty good way. So if I click on that icon, I'm looking through the camera. If I toggle it off, I'm looking through the perspective or the editor camera. Okay, I'll introduce another camera just to demonstrate that point. Just a standard camera. I have camera 1. Of course, I can rename this. I'll call this my bird's eye cam. And if I want to look through the bird's eye cam, I can click it. This is my the camera I'm looking through. If I click here, this would be my closer, more intimate view that I composed the first time around. So I can toggle between those, and if I just toggle that button off, now I'm back in the editor view. So that's going to be the process that I'm using here. I'm actually going to get rid of the bird's eye cam in just a moment, but while it's up, I'm going to use this camera to demonstrate some of the things, some of the changes or some of the enhancements that we have when we're looking at a camera. Cameras are great because you can think of them as kind of bookmarking a composition. So if I find a composition that I think that I want to use for my animation, maybe I want to focus on the feet, I can choose, compose that view, and now if I ever want to go back to this view, as long as I have a camera here, I can always get right back to that view, okay, just by looking through that camera. Okay, so we can compose a shot and establish a camera at that shot. In addition to that, if we're looking through the camera, we do have real-world camera settings that we can start to apply to our scene. So in other words, we have a focal length of the lens, we have an aperture that we can set. The focal length is tied to the field of view, and as I change these parameters, I'll just take a look at my camera here for a minute. As I go with a wider field of view, I get a broader viewport that I can look through, and if I look through my bird cam here, and I'll just zoom in, as I change my field of view, so I widen my lens, I'm actually starting to get more of a distortion inside my geometry, just like we would by looking through a real wide-angle lens of a camera. Of course, we can do some white balancing and some other things. In addition to that, we can actually set depth of field. Depth of field, if you remember back from the 3D design class, is a very valuable thing. We'll start to use the depth of field in the upcoming projects. Certainly feel free to experiment with it in this project. I'm not going to use it in my render because I don't have enough going on in my environment at this point. But keep in mind that that is an option. To start to blur the foreground and the background, make it start to look like emulate a real-world camera. So, but right now I have my camera set. Okay, now my goal was to create the rotation, to create a rotating camera, and I want to rotate this camera based on the exact same position of the camera that I've established. Now I want maybe a still camera. Okay, so I'll call this. This will be my still camera. Okay, now this camera is not going to move. Now I'm going to select this camera and I want to copy it. Let's see if I can right click. I'm looking for copy. I don't see it, so I'll just Command C and Command V, and I get a copy of the still camera. I'm going to change the name from still camera 1 to orbit camera. Now the orbit camera, this is the thing that I want to cause to orbit around my walk character. So I have two cameras. They're in the exact same starting position. That's why it looks like I still only have one camera. At the beginning of time, this is the position that I want to start the camera to rotate. Now, if I take my orbit camera and I go to rotate, and I rotate my camera, I'm actually just rotating the field of view or what it's looking at. Now, what I could do is there are two different kinds of cameras inside Cinema 4D, and maybe you've discovered this. There is a standard camera, and then there's also this thing called a target camera. Now, when I create a target camera, it does not adopt the current viewport composition. So if I go back to the Move tool, you can see that I have an additional camera inside the scene. I have this thing called camera, and it comes with a companion object, and it's called camera target 1. If I select the camera, I can move that camera back. If I move it up or down, you can see that it always points at a point in 3D space. That is linked to the camera target. If I select the camera target object and I lift that up, now it's moving what the camera is pointing at. So I have two different ways of dealing with this. I could establish a target camera, And then whenever I move the camera, it's always pointing at the actual object or its target. Okay. Now, target cameras can be a little tricky because of the way that they work. It's kind of nice because they're always composed at a point in space. But moving or trying to get that to orbit around the object can be quite tricky. So I'm going to show you an alternate technique. I could, use this target cam. The target cam is great for kind of a flyby. If you want to fly past your target, that would be a really great use of it. So the target cam is really great for flyby, okay? And maybe you want to do a simple flyby animation. And just to demonstrate that, I'll position my camera, let's say here. I'm not even really looking at the composition, but I have a sense that it'll work. I'm going to mark the first keyframe. I'll advance the playhead. I'll only go to frame 90, even though I have 180 frames. And I'll just change the position of the camera. I'll record that keyframe, and now if I look through my flyby cam, I'll hit the rewind button and hit play. Okay, that's my target camera. It makes it really easy to stay composed on the shot. Okay, so I'll call this flyby cam. There's my flyby cam. Okay, but really what I want to focus on, the whole reason I started this demonstration, if you remember, is because I want a nice clean orbit camera. Now the way that I'm going to do this is, remember, the still camera and the orbit camera are starting from the exact same position. And this will come into play when, if I want to splice these clips together, if I want a still animation and then transition to the camera orbiting, I can do that through some really simple video editing. I'm going to take the orbit camera and I'm going to group this object onto itself. Okay, and so just to clean up the object manager, I'm going to get rid of my flyby camera. I can reintroduce it later if I decide I want to use it. I'm going to select the orbit camera and I'm going to group it onto itself. Now remember, that's just putting it inside a null object. This is a technique we used in the design class. We used it before in the in this motion class briefly. If I go to objects, and I can choose to group objects, or I can hold down Alt-G, and on the Mac the Alt is the Option key. I'm going to group that object. Now what it does is it just creates a null object and places the orbit camera inside the null object. The null object is just a simple empty container. It's something that can be positioned in space. You can throw stuff in it. If you group more than one object, you get both of those objects inside the null. I'll just undo that and I'll show you an alternate way. Somewhere buried in here. There it is. There's a null object. Under geometry, null. Now this is version 12. I believe in a previous version it's nested under. I believe it's under these functions here, but I could be wrong about that. There's a null object. If I just create a null object, okay, that creates a null object in the origin of the space, origin of the world, and I can drop my orbit camera inside that null object. Now, you're probably scratching your head saying, Bill, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Well, remember, a null object, and I'll just undo that again just to demonstrate this, a couple different ways to do this. If I select that orbit camera and I Option G to group, when I select that null object, I'm actually modifying the position of the null, not the position of the camera. And the cool thing about a null is if I have the null selected and I go to the Move Axis tool, I can move its axis and line that up with a point in space, and I'll just leave it right here is fine, even though it's off to the side just a bit from my subject. If I can move the axis of a null object without modifying or converting it from a parametric, because it's not a primitive of any sort, I've moved the registration point. So now when I go to rotate, if I'm rotating the null that I have selected, okay, I have this object rotating around a pivot point. And if I rotate that exactly 360 degrees, I'll get a really great orbit. Okay, now I'm going to undo that because I'm just going to undo that for a minute. This null object, there's a couple different ways to create a null object, as I just mentioned. I'm going to undo until that null goes away. If I select the orbit camera and I group itself, the null that I've created, its origin point is in the exact same position as the camera. I'll undo. If I create a null based on this geometry menu, that null is created at the same position that any other piece of geometry or any other object is created in Cinema 4D, which means that it's created at the origin, at 0, 0, 0, inside that 3D space. There's an advantage to this, that if I select or create that null and I put the camera in that, it's exactly at the center of the world. So if I take the null and I select it and I go to rotation and I rotate that, it's going to rotate exactly around the 0 point in space. Now, you know, we're kind of in a chicken and an egg situation, because I could take that same technique, select my orbit camera and group it, which gives me the null, and then go to the axis tool and zero out the position and the rotation coordinates of that null, and I'm achieving the same thing. Okay, so I'll zero out the position and the rotation, and I'll hit apply, and that anchors the access point of the null object, which contains the camera, into the origin space. It's achieving the same thing. Now, whether you want to group the object and zero out its coordinates and go back to the move tool and now rotate, versus I'll just undo until my null goes away. Alternatively, I'll create a null and drop the camera in it. Okay? Either way, I'm achieving the same thing. There are some advantages and disadvantages to each of the workflow. You'll figure out the nuance of those. But my goal here is to take that null. I'm in the object mode of the tool with rotation selected. I'm going to scrub my playhead back to the beginning of time. I'm going to record the first keyframe. I'm going to slide my little slider down so I see the last frame. I'll make sure that my playhead is on frame 180. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my perspective just a little bit here. With that null selected, I'm going to rotate along the green axis, and I'm going to rotate that. I'm holding down the shift key and I'm watching for it to hit 360 degrees. I'll release and I'll record the keyframe. Now I'll rewind and I'll hit play. And now I have a camera that's rotating around my walk cycle. I have a still camera that is the origin, the beginning or the end of my orbit camera. And so if I just look through my orbit camera and I hit play, this is now the effect that we just achieved. So I'm going to render out my orbit camera, and I'll do that by going to my render settings. My general tab is just fine. My output is just fine. I want to go to my save path, and I'll call this walk 720 orbit, so that I know what the motion of the camera is, and I'll call that 01 because it's the first version of the orbit that we're rendering. And I'm going to save what I've been working on before I render in case it crashes or doesn't quit rendering. And I'm just going to click on that render button, and now I'm going to generate the render based on the orbit cam. Because I'm looking through the orbit cam in my perspective viewport, whatever I render in that viewport, that's going to be the output video. So I'll turn this video off, and we'll catch up in the next presentation when this render is complete.